Thank you everybody for your time. I appreciate you picking 2FA to attend today. What we'll be talking about is two-factor authentication, which is using something other than a username and password to authenticate to things like Windows, websites, applications. What we do at 2FA is something a little bit different. Is we have something called an authentication platform, which has 7 different forms of authentication within a single software. So one of the most common ones that we have is the use of building access technology, RFID card that lots of folks carry around. It could be a card or a fob that you tap on a reader and the door opens. Pretty reliable technology. Here I'm doing it with a Dell ATG for a Dell ATG. So law enforcement likes to use these ruggedized Dells and Panasonics. In this case, I've tapped my badge. Same one that I use to get into the door. We support about 80 different types of technologies and enter a PIN. So that'll be compliant for things like HIPAA compliance, CJIS compliance for FBI, NERC compliance. But we try to balance between convenience and security. And what I'd like to do is walk you through a presentation. First off, ask you to think about overall identity. So when we talk about in the presentation, there's lots of things that make up who you are. And I would tell you a little bit about who I am. So my name is Greg Salyards. I'm a husband. I'm a father. I'm a son. I'm a brother. I'm a brother-in-law. I'm an uncle. I'm a friend. I'm a homeowner. I'm a car owner. I'm a dog owner. I'm a tourist. I'm a patient. Think about all the things that we leave as we go through. You've got all these different identities that you assume. Patient is one that we generally think about when you go into a healthcare organization, whether it's a dental office or a healthcare office. You're providing your information, you're providing social security number, you're providing your healthcare identifiable information. As customers, we're leaving information, whether it's home data, personal identifiable information, social security numbers, financial data. As subscribers, we're doing the same. We're going up and signing up for a service. You're leaving your birth date, your telephone number. We have to establish some level of trust with those organizations that they're going to do the right thing with our data, although in a lot of cases we know that they're not. I'm also a veteran. I like to think I'm a little bit of a joker. Halloween comes around, I like to dress up. I'm a vendor. I'm a president and CEO of a software company. And today I'm your presenter. So think about all the different things that we do in our daily lives, and the list really goes on. You leave little crumbs of your identity pretty much wherever you go. You're doing that here today. You're going to get calls from vendors for the next 10, 20 weeks saying you were at the CCD show, you're following up, and you were stopped by the booth and you didn't. But we all want to protect that identity data, right? So as individuals, we're responsible for protecting our own data. As employees, we really rely upon the corporation or the company that we work for to protect that data. But we have to entrust, in all cases, we have to entrust some information to those third parties. And unfortunately, that information gets stolen. And you've probably heard about the big hacking events that have happened over the last few years. What's happening is things are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So many of you probably heard about Target. Target was one of the most expensive hacks on record. It cost Target upwards of $165 million to address that hack, doing things like notifying you individually, paying for card reissuance, buying identity theft protection, putting things in place. So there was a direct cost associated with this hack. In the end, it was about 4 individuals sitting in a foreign country that perpetrated the attack. So think about that as we go through the presentation. You know, historically, you had mobsters, you had other folks that were trying to break into physical facilities, break into the bank, break into the art dealer, break into the coin dealer, the jewelry, right? And those heists were what we've always protected against, right? Gates, guns, and guards. We've got physical access monitoring, we've got locks, we've got video surveillance. We spend a lot of time and a lot of money protecting our physical assets. The question is, you generally get notified when your information is vulnerable and it's been affected. Right now, things like with the Target breach, your bank account or your credit card information may have been hacked, you'll get notified by your bank that you were involved in potential breach and that they're going to reissue the card. Right? That's the way that's usually happening. But you don't really know from the other places where they're not being responsible and not notifying you that your information was hacked. So for the most part, we look at our identities. There's a fairly clear line between our private lives and our corporate lives. There's some scenarios like LinkedIn where there might be a meshing of both. But in our private lives, we do what we can to protect our own information. So that, and physical assets. So that might be, getting a dog, putting locks on the door, buying an alarm system, buying a gun, doing things to protect you and your family and your physical resources. As consumers, you'll find that there are new tools coming out. Most folks have heard of things like Google Authenticator or SMS password, one-time passwords. When you go to log on to a site, you've forgotten your password, they might send you a one-time password, or you might get a telephone call. So these tools, as consumers, are starting to come out, but think about what you're doing in your daily lives as far as the corporation. We're generally just using username and passwords. So you have to ask about why are we targets as individuals? Why do people want to get my credit card information? That one's pretty obvious. So if they can get a hold of your credit card information, and they're not necessarily just doing yours, but they're going for databases. Target was 160 million records. Neiman Marcus was about 60 million records. And so small groups of hackers can gain access to this data, and then they sell that data on the internet. So globally, on average, it's about $1.50 per credit card. We start looking at here in the US, certain cards can get up to, if you've got an Amex Black, that could be up to $50 per card. We get concerned when we're at a restaurant, we give our card to a waiter or waitress, they potentially swipe that data on a connected reader, and what they do is they reprint that onto a gift card, and they'll go sell that gift card to somebody for $50 or $100. But that gift card works perpetually until the bank recognizes it and it gets turned off. So credit card information, pretty simple. You've got a card, it's got data on it, somebody can steal it and they can get money for it. If you look at 160 million cards stolen in one event, upwards of $300 million was gained from that one heist. Very, very significant. But let's look at healthcare data. This is where the market has shifted now. Anybody hear about the recent Anthem hack? So prior to Anthem, between 25 and 30 million healthcare records in the United States have been stolen. The Department of Health and Human Services has a website they call the Wall of Shame. And anybody or any organization that had more than 50 records that had been compromised got put on the Wall of Shame. So over the last years, it was between 25 and 30 million. But in one single event with Anthem, there were 80 million healthcare records that were stolen. Affected organizations like Blue Cross and Blue Shield, some of the major health insurance carriers. So the question is why? A lot of times you look at like celebrities, that could be an area that you might want to find out some information, presidents, senior administrators of corporations. But what we were finding is that they want to get that healthcare information so they can get services that they're not entitled to. So it's Medicare, Medicaid fraud, directly impacts us as citizens, taxpayers, where our taxes are being increased based upon healthcare fraud. But it's also from the higher end folks that have premium healthcare services, having the capability to go and get services that that person otherwise isn't entitled to. Those records are going upwards of $1,000 per record, and even more in some cases. So compare these digital cyber threats to the largest physical heist in U.S. history, which happened to be with a Dunbar armored truck in 1997. It's an $18 million heist, biggest in U.S. history. There's some other ones in the world that were bigger. There was the Boston art theft that was upwards of $100 million. There was some over in Iraq that were much larger. But we spend a ton of money on the gates, guns, and guards to prevent theft of our physical property. The reality is that the shift from physical theft to digital theft has occurred. People no longer are breaking into banks through force. They're going through and they're doing cyber attacks. There's a bank in the Middle East that had a $5 billion hack. and it's suspected that it was ISIS or Al-Qaeda. So as employees, we rely on employers to provide us tools. We don't generally go out and get dogs or guns and bring those to work. So we look at tools that our employers can provide us. And generally you'll see there's cards that you use for physical access. There may be physical access monitoring. You may have to swipe your fingerprint in for time and attendance. But as users, we want to have anytime, anywhere access. And there's folks that are on their mobile phones checking their email, you're checking Salesforce, you're checking other databases, you're making sure that your business is running as expected as you're away from the office. And that's what people expect nowadays. So we look at what technology can help prevent cyber theft. And generally folks are looking for the magic bullet. The reality is that there isn't. You have to look at lots of different types of technologies, layer in, they call it depth and defense, but different types of technology that protect you. We will look at authentication. There's terms 2-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication, strong authentication. It's really something other than username and password. So we look at some of the organizations that have put 2-factor authentication in place, the US government being one of them. They spend a ton of money on contact smart cards known as a CAC card. I believe I have one here. So that's used for physical access, has a chip technology on it. You'll be seeing those come into the US market in credit cards. But the chip is associated with a PIN, and there's digital certificates and keys that are on here that are exchanged once a PIN is entered. In this case, the Chinese, and they've definitively determined this, the Chinese gained access to the F-35 fighter jet information a few years ago. And the cost to the US government for that, they put a price tag on it, $1.4 trillion. What had happened, and this is around education, is the person had left their card inside of their computer because they didn't want to take it out. There was some malware placed on that computer that sniffed the PIN. When the computer was sitting idle, the malware played back the PIN, looked for the information, decrypted the information, and then sent off the information. So this is an area where even having a strong 2-factor solution didn't work because there wasn't correct employee education. If that employee had pulled out their card, that wouldn't happen. If they had right malware detection on those computers, it wouldn't happen. So folks may have heard of RSA. They create a token, RSA Secure ID, pretty popular solution. What happened in this case with Lockheed Martin, this was for I believe it was the Phantom, is that the hackers broke into RSA, took secret seed files that are used associated with the tokens, and then went over to Lockheed Martin and broke into Lockheed Martin with the data that they had stolen from RSA. So this was a couple of years back. As a result of what we're seeing is we're seeing CFOs, CEOs testifying in front of Congress. These are Target and Neiman Marcus having to explain why and how that many US citizens were affected by their failure to protect credit card information. So that's in a scenario where they're trying to close the barn door after the cows come out. We see that too many times. So there are stronger forms of authentication, lots of different tools. The question is selecting the right one. And that's when we look at, in 1965 at MIT, they created the first system that used username and password to log onto a computer. In 1965, that system was hacked. And MIT was very concerned about it. They didn't talk about it for a long time. But the same year that they created username and password logon was the same year that it got hacked. Flash forward 50 years, we're still using that same technology today. It's the most prevalent form of authentication used. So what is the right technology? It really depends on your scenario. What we preach at 2FA is risk-appropriate authentication. So look at your user population, look at your different scenarios. It may be remote access, it may be on-premise, you may have third parties that are coming in. So one size doesn't necessarily fit all. And so for 2FA, what we have is an authentication platform. So using something stronger than a username and password, and potentially something more convenient. Right? Trying to balance convenience and security is very important. If you go out to your employees today that are logging on with a simple username and password and say we're going to go to a 8-character alphanumeric password that changes every 10 days, you're going to get very upset. Right? Even if you change that to 90 days, they're going to get very upset. Because what they have today is relatively easy. If they forget it, they'll give you a call. I apologize. They'll give you a call, and you can reset the password. Right? They rely upon the administrators. Right? So it works for them. It may not work all the time, but it works, and they've got a process for fallback. We start getting into things like fingerprint biometrics. Fingerprint biometrics work for most of the people all the time, but they don't work for all the people all the time. There's usually, in a large organization, there's about 5% of the user population that falls. And it's usually older folks, Asians, and Black folks. So you won't find that out until you do a full deployment of biometrics. You may have to find different readers for that. Things like RFID technology work. When you present a badge to a door, the door generally opens. But the scenarios of somebody leaving that badge at home, the badge getting broken, the reader getting broken. So looking at different scenarios, we generally recommend a fallback solution. So today you have username and password, and the fallback is calling IT to have a reset of that password. So if you're going to put in something else, make sure you have a fallback that they can fall back to. It doesn't necessarily need to be a weaker fallback. It could be things like fingerprint biometric and a card solution. If you look at the new Dell systems that are shipping, there's a fingerprint swipe and there's an RFID technology. So within 2FA, we've been around now for about 9 years. We're headquartered in Austin. We work here with the city, has us deployed in the city of Milwaukee. We have about 50 law enforcement agencies throughout Wisconsin that are using our software, as well as lots of different private sector organizations. We're in 25 different countries. We integrate well with VMware, Citrix, VDI type environments. I'd say the bigger industries that use us are public sector, healthcare, financial services, and utilities. But what we find is that there's a commonality across all these industries. We like to call this the 3 C's. And it's compliance, convenience, and cost reduction. And there's also compelling events, which is really quite common. But compliance is with different industry, non-industry regulated standards where the government has stepped in and said you must do this. So we see that in public sector with CJIS compliance. We see it in public works with the NERC compliance for critical infrastructure protection. We see it in healthcare with HIPAA and high-tech and meaningful use requirements. And we're seeing it in other industries as well, financial services and over-regulation. But generally what we see when we go to different industries, it's different compelling reasons. So public sector, they're doing it because they have to do it, they're being told to do it, so there's a compliance requirement. But generally in all cases, they have to do it, they look for something that's easy. They look for something that users like to use, right? So that's generally the second thing. When we go into some other industries like healthcare, it's all about convenience. They want to keep the doctors happy. They want to make it so they can just tap a card or swipe a finger. They don't really care about 2-factor authentication using a PIN or a password. They want rapid access for the doctors so they can, one, see more patients, bill more, but keep them happy and working for their facilities. So about the 2FA solution, it's an all-in-one solution. So all 7 forms of authentication are provided in a single platform. So you have the capability to mix and match. So you may have remote access users that are using one-time password, and you may have folks that are on-premise that are using fingerprint biometrics. There's no additional cost for that. You can mix and match. You can migrate from one to the other. The nice thing is that you avoid here is the rip and replaces. So we're seeing some first-generation adopters of 2-factor authentication that adopted the one-time password tokens, now saying, well, that only works for remote access. I need something for on-premise. Where users lose these little key fobs, I don't like that anymore. Right? So having the capability to mix and match and migrate from one technology to another is very important when you look at 2-factor authentication. We also have something called single sign-on, so the capability to sign into the operating system or onto a portal and then get application access that may have access to other applications by using a single sign-on capability. So the remote access piece is also very important. So if you have an on-premise solution, you are going to have folks traveling, you are going to have remote access users. The other thing is that you don't need to deploy your whole organization. We have plenty of organizations that look at just starting off, let's protect the doctors, let's protect the financial folks, let's lock down the privileged administrator accounts, let's lock down folks that have access to important intellectual property. So it doesn't have to be a broad brushstroke. It can be very specific to individuals that have specific access. So I showed at the beginning the ability to log on with an RFID card. I'm going to show another common one. So many of us have gone to websites before, and you arrive at the website, and it might be your username's already pre-populated, and you have to put in the password. And you find out quickly after you typed in the first one that this is a website that made you change your common password. Maybe it was a uppercase character, or you had to have certain special characters, and you generally just default back to that lost password scenario and hope that it worked. So this is something that we have. It's called Ping Me. You can put in a password. What I've done is I push that. I just got a mobile verification to my phone, and it's going to tell me on my phone that G. Salyards is attempting to log into this website from this geographic location, this date and time, and I'm going to hit approve. What you'll see, without having to remember a password, I'm going to be logged into this website. Right, so that's really where the market's going, where you have something physical that the user has, adding in biometrics even better, so you can have a user identity plus proof possession of a specific device, and that's how we're getting away from the use of username and passwords. So with that, that concludes my presentation. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, this is very interesting to me. So, how do you, currently people use channel desktop,
Sure.
some other software to connect to somebody else's computer. But at the corporate level, how do they use this to works?
Yeah, so we see that quite often. So there's things like, what the gentleman's asking is having to do things like remote access. One of the most common ones, there's one Log Me In. There's another one that's a remote desktop solution. So this is just Microsoft Remote Desktop. What we've done is we've built in different credential providers into that, so they could do things like a one-time password. I've been prompted here, I can present my RFID card. And enter a PIN. And what this is doing, this is authenticating me to a remote server. It could be a remote desktop. We integrate generally with Microsoft products and other remote desktop products. Things like Log Me In, we generally do on the near side, unless we can get to the Windows logon or the operating system logon on the far side.
Yeah, very good.
Yes, sir.
How does it integrate with Citrix?
Yeah, so good question. There's a couple layers. So general Citrix, where you're logging onto your desktop, is generally integrated to Windows. When the Citrix session is open, we have the capability to do single sign-on. So if it's a Zen app or that's local resident to that machine, we can do single sign-on to it. We can also layer authentication over. So when the user opens up the Citrix Zen app, that we require them to tap their card or present their finger. So that's one scenario.
Is it separate from the Citrix integrated single sign-on, or is it your own single sign-on?
It's separate. So Citrix has their own SSO that's part of their premium maintenance plan. We also have SSO within our product. So here the user could open up an application and the user doesn't have to enter in the username and password with that. They can just log in. So generally what we find with Citrix is the kiosk scenario with Citrix, or Citrix Netscape. So in the kiosk environment, imagine you're in the hospital, a lot of folks that are sitting in the hospital room waiting for the doctor to come in, you might have wiggled the mouse or touched the keyboard. It's generally an open desktop. But they lock those down generally, and so when you open up a single app, you have to log into that. But they call those kiosks or computer on wheels, BMWs. And what they generally do is leave those wide open. What we can do is we can secure that Windows logon environment, so when the user comes and taps their card or swipes their finger, we are connected in. Citrix has something called the Fast Connect API. And what we do is we auto-launch through that authentication their VDI session. Generally Zen Desktop. We do it with VMware Horizon View, 2X, Quest, and Microsoft Remote Desktop Services. What that does is that the user taps their card, enters their PIN, their kiosk opens up, it brings up their applications, like in healthcare that they'd be logging onto in the EHR. And then when the doctor wants to log off, they tap their card, and they go over to the next examiner, and they can tap their card again, and we'll bring that same session up for them in a nice clinical workflow. So those are the two different scenarios. NetScaler is more of the remote access, and so we have the capability to add code to the NetScaler page. So if you want to do things like fingerprint biometrics or RFID, or things like the ping me or one-time password access. Does that answer your question? Any other questions? Well, for here, the folks that are Milwaukee-based, CCD has the capability to sell our software. They're very well educated on it, so if you have questions, you work with them. John Hermanson is their resident expert. You can also give us a call. So I'll be here for a little while longer today, and if you have any additional questions, stop by. So thank you very much for your time.